How could you sleep with my best friend, you shameless woman? Before we delve in, I want to let you know that your support means a lot to us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for joining us. Greg was an average man with an average life. He worked at a small company and earned just enough to take care of himself. He had only been at his job for about a year. One weekend evening, feeling a bit lonely, Greg decided to treat himself to a nice dinner. He went to a well-known and expensive restaurant in the city. While sitting at his table, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere, Greg noticed a beautiful lady sitting alone, sipping on a cocktail. She looked so classy and attractive that Greg couldn't take his eyes off her. She had a natural glow, and her style was on point. She noticed him staring and didn't seem too pleased. To avoid the awkwardness, she quietly moved to another seat a little farther away. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Greg quickly ordered his meal. He finished eating just around the same time the lady finished her drink. Coincidentally, they both stood up to leave at the same moment. Greg had the urge to speak to her, but he didn't know if she would even give him the time of day. Still, he went outside first and waited for her near the entrance. Greg was neatly dressed. He wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers. His shoes were polished, and he smelled good. He stood confidently, hoping she'd give him a minute of her time. When she finally stepped outside, Greg walked up to her and said kindly, "Hello, pretty. How are you doing?" She looked at him with a bit of an attitude and said sharply, "I'm Peggy, and how can I help you?" Greg introduced himself with a warm smile, and surprisingly, they exchanged contact information. That night, however, Greg didn't call her. He remembered how rude she had sounded and decided not to take it personally, but also not to chase her too fast. The next day, Greg still didn't call. Peggy, deep down, expected him to call. 2 weeks later, Greg finally dialed her number. She picked up the call and sounded as rude as before. Still, Greg tried to have a short conversation with her and ended the call politely. Even though she was a bit rough, Greg had a strange feeling like there was something underneath her attitude. Maybe it was a red flag, but he chose to give her a chance. Days turned to weeks, and weeks turned into months. Slowly, they started a relationship. After 5 months, Peggy's true character began to show. She was always demanding, always complaining, and very selfish. She wanted money for everything, clothes, shoes, hair, and never cared if Greg had it or not. Greg tried to ignore her bad behavior. He believed that no one was perfect and everyone had flaws. He tried to focus on the good in her, even when it was hard to see. 1 year into the relationship, one of Greg's friends at work threw a birthday party for his fiancée. He invited his friends and told them to bring their partners. Greg decided to take Peggy with him. But before the party, Greg and Peggy had a big argument. Peggy wanted a large amount of money to buy a fancy dress, shoes, and new hair for the event. Greg told her that he couldn't afford that kind of money just for a party. Peggy became angry and refused to speak to him for days. Peggy was selfish and had no respect for Greg. She constantly asked him for money without thinking about his own needs. At one point, Greg thought about starting a small business for her since she didn't have a job. He asked her what kind of business she might like to do. She said she would love to open a unisex boutique. Greg agreed. He used most of his savings and helped Peggy start the business. They went to the market together, bought clothes and accessories, and stocked the shop. For the first time ever, Peggy was thankful. She looked at him and said, "Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it." Greg felt happy. He hoped that this would help Peggy become more independent and responsible. But that happiness didn't last long. 1 month later, Greg started noticing strange behavior from Peggy. She received odd phone calls at night, and sometimes she disappeared without explanation. His instincts told him something was wrong. He felt she might be cheating. One weekend, Peggy stayed over at Greg's place. On Monday morning, while she was in the bathroom, her phone buzzed. A message popped up. Greg wasn't the kind to snoop, but something pulled his attention to it. The message read, "Baby, I'm at the hotel waiting for you." Greg's heart broke. His chest felt heavy. But he didn't say anything immediately. He stayed calm and played mind games, acting like he hadn't seen anything. 1 week later, Greg decided to confront her. When he asked her about the text, she denied everything and flipped the situation. insulting him and calling him names. Greg was down, at least in his heart. But he didn't kick her out. He wanted her to walk out on her own. After throwing her tantrums and shouting nonsense, Peggy left Greg's house. Peggy was a cheat, a gold digger, a rude and arrogant person. 1 month after their argument, Peggy met another man and started dating him secretly behind Greg's back. But little did she know, the new man was Greg's cousin, Fredrick. Fredrick was charming and financially stable. Peggy fell for him fast. 4 months later, Fredrick proposed to her. She accepted immediately without even officially breaking up with Greg. 1 month later, she shamelessly brought a wedding invitation card to Greg. Greg smiled as he collected it and nodded his head. What Peggy didn't know was that Greg already knew everything. Fredrick had told him about the woman he was planning to marry. Out of curiosity, Greg asked to see a picture. When Fredrick showed him the photo, it was Peggy. Greg was shocked, but he didn't show it. He didn't want to ruin his cousin's plans or cause drama. 2 weeks before their wedding, Greg was walking home from work one evening when he saw a homeless woman sitting quietly by the roadside. She looked tired, dirty, and sad like someone who had lost everything. Greg felt something in his heart. He walked up to her and asked, "How are you?" She replied softly, "I'm fine." He asked a few more questions to check if she was mentally stable. She was perfectly fine, just depressed and broken. Greg offered to take her home, and she agreed. That night, Greg prepared her a warm meal, gave her clean clothes, and let her rest. Later, he asked gently, "Please, if you don't mind, can you tell me what happened to you?" The woman, whose name was Matilda, opened up. She told Greg that her fiancé had tricked her, took all her money, and ran off to marry another woman without saying goodbye. She had lost her job, her savings, and her dignity. Greg felt sorry for her. He knew exactly how it felt to be betrayed by someone you trusted. 3 days before the wedding, Greg came home with some beautiful shopping bags. He quietly walked into the guest room where Matilda was resting. Without saying much, he dropped the bags in front of her and said, "Try these dresses on. You'll be going with me to a wedding ceremony in 2 days." Matilda was shocked. She hadn't expected anything like that. She looked inside the bags and was stunned. The dresses were stunning, elegant, and well-fitted. The jewelry sparkled like stars in the night sky. For the first time in a long while, Matilda felt truly happy. Her face lit up with joy, and her heart fluttered with excitement. She hadn't felt this way in years. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted off her. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The wedding hall was beautifully decorated. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and colorful flowers filled the entire space. Everything looked magical, like a scene from a fairy tale. Guests were dressed in their finest clothes. Music played softly in the background, and laughter filled the air. Peggy, the bride, looked extremely happy. It was her big day. Meanwhile, Greg was getting ready with Matilda. They were dressed elegantly. When they arrived at the wedding venue, the hall was already filled with guests. All eyes turned to the entrance as Greg walked in, holding Matilda's hand gently. Peggy saw them the moment they stepped in. Her smile froze. She stared at them in shock and confusion. Who was this woman Greg was holding hands with? She looked graceful. Peggy felt a sudden wave of jealousy. The woman with Greg looked beautiful, confident, and comfortable beside him. For the first time, Peggy felt like someone else had discovered what she had thrown away, something precious. What Peggy didn't know was that Greg had given Matilda some money before they left for the wedding. He had filled her purse with crisp dollar bills and asked her to spray the couple with it during the celebration. And, most surprisingly, Greg was the one who had paid for the entire wedding. What no one knew was that Greg came from a very wealthy family. He was the only son of a successful businessman, but he had kept his true identity hidden. He wanted to find a woman who would love him for who he truly was, not for his money or social status. Peggy had no idea about Greg's background. She had dated him before, but ended things because she thought he was just an average man. She had chosen money over love and walked away, only to end up marrying someone else. As the wedding went on, everything seemed to be going well. People were eating, laughing, and dancing. Then, it was time for Matilda and Greg to walk up to Peggy and her groom, Fredrick, to spray them with money. As they moved closer, Matilda's eyes widened in shock. Fredrick. She recognized him instantly. He was the same man who had once stolen her money and left her homeless. The man who had promised her love and security but took everything and disappeared. Her hands trembled. Her smile faded. Tears welled up in her eyes. She couldn't take it. Without saying a word, she turned around and rushed out of the hall, trying to hide the tears running down her cheeks. Greg followed her immediately. He was worried. He caught up with her near one of the parked cars outside and gently asked, "What's wrong? Why did you run out like that?" Matilda wiped her eyes and slowly explained. "That man in there, Fredrick, he's the reason I became homeless. He stole all my savings and vanished. I trusted him, I loved him, and he destroyed my life." Greg's heart sank. He was devastated by the revelation. He hadn't known any of this. He gently held Matilda's hand and whispered, "I'm so sorry, but you're no longer that broken woman. You've come a long way. Don't let him steal your happiness again." He teased her a little, made her smile, and eventually helped her calm down. They both returned to the wedding hall like nothing had happened. Greg still held her hand as they approached the dancing couple again. Matilda, trying to stay strong, sprayed the couple with money. After a few more minutes of smiling for the crowd, they quietly left the venue. Later that evening, after the wedding, everyone went back home. Peggy and Fredrick returned to their hotel room. But peace did not follow them. Fredrick was restless. His past had caught up with him in the worst possible way. He never imagined that he would run into Matilda again, especially not on his wedding day. He couldn't forgive himself for what he had done to her. Guilt ate at his heart. Meanwhile, Peggy was curious and confused. She asked Fredrick how he knew Greg. After a long silence, Fredrick finally told her the truth. "Greg is my cousin," he said. "He's the one who sponsored our entire wedding. He comes from a wealthy family. His father is a successful business tycoon. Greg is the only son." Peggy stared at him in disbelief. "You're telling me Greg paid for all this?" "Yes," Fredrick replied. "A month before the wedding, I gave him our invitation. He promised to support us, and he kept that promise." Suddenly, Peggy felt sick to her stomach. She realized what a terrible mistake she had made. She had once dated Greg, but because she thought he was just an ordinary man, she left him. Now she knew the truth and it was too late. Regret filled her heart. She had chased after riches and ended up losing real love. That night, Peggy and Fredrick lay in bed, but their hearts were far from each other. Peggy thought about Greg and what she had lost. Fredrick thought about Matilda and the damage he had done. A month passed. Matilda still didn't know about Greg's true identity. To her, Greg was just a kind man with a normal job. She had no idea he was a millionaire. One evening, Greg asked Matilda to come with him to a place. She agreed, not knowing what was ahead. They got into the car and drove for a while. Soon, they arrived at a huge gate. Beyond it stood a large, beautiful mansion. Expensive cars were parked in the driveway. The mansion looked like something out of a movie. Matilda's mouth fell open. "What are we doing here?" she asked. "I don't belong in a place like this. I'm just a homeless woman." Greg smiled gently and said, "Who said you're homeless? This is your home now." Matilda laughed nervously. "Are you joking?" But Greg didn't say a word. He simply took her hand and led her into the mansion. In the living room sat an older man with a newspaper and a glass of wine, Greg's father. When he saw them, he smiled and said, "So you finally brought me a wife." Matilda stood there, stunned and confused. Greg and his father shared a laugh. Then Greg's cousins came out and welcomed Matilda warmly. After the introductions, Greg reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He got down on one knee. "Matilda," he said, "will you be my queen forever?" Tears rolled down her cheeks. She couldn't believe what was happening. She nodded yes, and they hugged each other tightly. Greg wiped the tears from her face as everyone clapped and cheered. That night, they drove back to Greg's apartment. A week later, Greg resigned from his job. His mission had been completed. He had found the love he was searching for. They packed their belongings and moved into the mansion together. 2 months later, Fredrick's world came crashing down. He discovered that Peggy was already pregnant with another man's child before their wedding. The truth broke him completely. "How could you be so heartless?" he shouted at her. "You slept with another man 2 weeks before our wedding? You're shameless, Peggy. I regret the day I met you." Peggy couldn't say anything. She stood in silence, ashamed and scared. Fredrick stood motionless, the dim light in the hotel room casting shadows on the wall like the ghosts of his past. Peggy was weeping, her mascara streaked down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Fredrick," she whispered, broken. "Then how did it go?" His voice was sharp, dangerous. She hesitated before saying the one name that made Fredrick's blood run cold. It was Victor. Fredrick's jaw clenched. "Victor? My best friend? My brother from another mother?" Peggy nodded slowly. "It was one night, when you were out drinking yourself into debt." The room fell into silence again, this time heavier, darker. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Matilda was blooming. The house had turned into a home. Greg's love was steady and warm, a healing balm after the chaos of her past. But that peace was about to be shattered. One evening, she heard Greg speaking to someone over the phone in the study. His voice was tense. "No, we can't let Fredrick come near her. He still doesn't know the full story." Matilda froze outside the door. Full story? What more was there? She knocked gently, pretending to need help with the wine opener. Greg smiled and kissed her forehead, completely unaware of what she heard. But from that moment, Matilda couldn't shake the feeling that a truth was being hidden from her. Back to Fredrick. Fredrick confronted Victor the next day. It wasn't pretty. "You crossed a line, man. You broke the one code that should never be broken." Victor didn't deny it. He stood tall, arrogant. "I loved her more than you ever did, and she came to me when you abandoned her." Fredrick swung, fist to jaw. Years of brotherhood crumbled on the cold pavement outside their old hangout spot. Victor spat blood and smiled. "You're not the only one with a past, Fred, and you're not the only one looking for redemption." The letter that changed everything. A week later, Matilda received a handwritten letter. No stamp, no name, just left at the front gate. It read, "You think you know Greg? Ask him what happened to Nina, then decide if you still trust him. A friend." Matilda sat on the edge of the bed, heart racing. Who was Nina? Another woman? A secret child? The investigation begins. Matilda hired someone from her old Jobin ex-colleague turned private eye. Within days, the report came in. Nina was Greg's ex-fiancee. She had disappeared 2 years ago after a nervous breakdown. Her family accused Greg of pushing her too hard, controlling her. The Daniels family paid the press to keep it quiet. Matilda confronted Greg. He didn't deny it. "She was fragile," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to handle her illness, but I never hurt her. I tried to help, I swear." But the damage was done. Matilda was no longer sure of what or who to believe. Out of nowhere, Peggy called Matilda. "I need to talk, woman to woman. It's about Fredrick." They met at a quiet cafe. Peggy looked worn, thinner, like life had drained her. "Victor used me, told me he loved me, then disappeared after I got pregnant." Matilda started, expression unreadable. "Why are you telling me this?" Peggy leaned in. "Because Fredrick's back, and I think he still loves you. He deserves the truth. About the baby, about Victor, about everything." Matilda stood up slowly, heart pounding. "You said he's back?" Later that night, Greg came home late. Matilda was sitting by the fireplace, red wine in hand, staring into the flames. "We need to talk," she said, voice calm but icy. "About what?" "About Nina, about Victor, about Fredrick, about all the lies you think I don't know." Greg looked stunned, but before he could speak, the doorbell rang. He opened it. Fredrick stood on the porch, rain pouring behind him. Behind him stood a toddler, clinging to his leg. "She's mine," Fredrick said, eyes locked on Matilda. "But you're the only woman I ever wanted to raise her with." To be continued.